Hey YouTube, I thought I'd stop by today and talk a little bit about the Pauline letters because I don't want there to be any confusion really about what my take is on the the Pauline letters. Yeah, I just gave it away there. My take is on Paul that they are Marcionite. The Pauline letters are Marcionite. Now, I don't know whether there was a real Paul or if Marcion himself wrote under the pseudonym of Paul, or if somebody else wrote under the pseudonym of Paul that was Marcionite. It doesn't really matter. It's all irrelevant. These texts, the authentic ones, came out of the Marcionite camp. All of them. And then it's only, there are two people that really give you a lot of insight into what the Pauline letters originally were. And the first one is Irenaeus. He goes on and he says that Marcion redacted Luke and the Pauline letters. Now, Irenaeus is a redactor, and he throws a lot of texts out as heretical. He canonizes 4 gospels and makes that a typically accepted. Those are the typically accepted texts. And he also redacts other texts. So, like, he talks about the Nicolaitans. The Nicolaitans are followers of the John Gospel. And he says that, about the Nicolaitans, that they didn't believe that Jesus was flesh. And he uses their own gospel against them. And it says, where it says the Word became flesh. Well, there's an excellent chance that Irenaeus wrote that in that text. He called them heretics, wrote it in the text, and sent that text to them and said, hey, look, you can either be on the fringe with the heretics or you can accept the new gospel. There are other ways to mitigate that particular line because flesh is a bit nebulous. And there's a possibility that that was actually original, but I kind of doubt it. And he makes a big stink about it. Irenaeus does. And Nicolaitans were a considerably older religion, and they didn't believe that Jesus was human flesh. And he uses their own gospel against them, which probably means that he just redacted their text. And Irenaeus redacts a lot of texts, and like I said, he throws a lot of other texts out. He, in Revelation, he decides essentially what the final version of Revelation is going to be. In the Pauline and Marcionite letters, he doesn't go into a lot of detail on the Pauline letters and the Marcionite gospel. He doesn't go into a lot of detail about it, but he does mention in passing one time, that Marcion redacted Luke, which is just bizarre. He talks because later in his texts, he actually ends up having an argument against the Marcionites. And that subject does not come up again. So I would suspect that when he said that Marcion altered Luke, that he got a lot of blowback from that, because in the last book, he doesn't say nothing about it. He's talking to them with texts that they assume. When we talk about the Marcionite canon, that's from 140. That's not from 185 when Irenaeus is talking about this stuff. And Irenaeus, he's using all kinds of texts that, when we look at them, we're saying, well, they don't have these texts. Well, that's not what he's saying. He's using Matthew against them. Matthew. And he's saying that, these are texts that they will accept. Well, whoa, that's not Marcionite canon. That's not the old 140 canon. So obviously the Marcionite canon has expanded since then. Obviously, but and he's arguing with them, but he's not arguing with their text at that point. So he probably got a lot of blowback from that statement. But then Tertullian comes along after Irenaeus, and he writes a 5-volume work against Marcion, just blasting the crap out of him. And it gets down to the last book, and it's really kind of weird because Tertullian, he comes in and he says that there's absolutely no record of Paul. There's no record of Paul. And he talks about Marcion, and he acts as if Marcion wrote Paul, as if Marcion either wrote the Pauline letters or, knew this guy Paul personally or whatever. He acts as if Paul is somebody that was totally bought off by Marcion, and Marcion was a wealthy guy, so, but, and then, he goes through this little argument with himself, and is really kind of weird, and he gets down to the point where he says, there are no records of this guy at all, he's Marcionite, and then all of a sudden, oh, here's Acts of the Apostles. Well, that fixes it. Between Irenaeus and Tertullian, they put that guy in the first century, but he was not first century. Paul was not in the first century. Paul was Marcionite. Whether or not Marcion wrote those texts, or whether there was a real guy named Paul, I have no idea on that. I have no idea. But he was Marcionite. Those letters were Marcionite. And when you go through the redactions and you see all these real interactions, like in 2 Corinthians, and where it talks about him going to prison, that's not real. That's a redaction based in Acts of the Apostles. So these letters were originally written between 120 and 140, the authentic ones, and they're Marcionite. And it's with Irenaeus and Tertullian that the interactions become real, and that certain things start becoming added to the text to force him into the first century, putting Paul in prison and stuff like that. That's just it's so absurd. Acts of the Apostles pretends that he was on the run all the time, that he was supposedly, just everybody was out to get him, and throw him in prison, etc., etc., etc. Well, if you go back to the Pauline letters, there's only like a couple mentions of that. The rest of the times, they're all, what do you call it? They're all kind of metaphorical. He's saying he's a prisoner of the Lord. He's in chains to the Lord, etc., etc. He's a slave to the Lord. He's not literally a prisoner. And they turn him into a literal prisoner in Acts. And so then you go back into the Pauline letters and start looking at where they're saying that he's a prisoner. He's literally a prisoner. And it's some of it is just blasted obvious, but Tertullian was right when he said there's no record of Paul. He was absolutely right. He's got records going back quite a ways on some of these other guys, but he has no records of this Paul guy at all. And then he comes by and says, oh, well, here's Acts of the Apostles. That fixes it. So, there is virtually nothing believable in the statements of Irenaeus or Tertullian regarding these texts. And Irenaeus probably redacted all of them. He probably added the 2 Corinthians prison mention. And yeah, that's my take on those letters. They're all Marcionite, all the authentic ones. Now, there are some that are later, and Tertullian doesn't even know. Tertullian doesn't even know why they're not in the text. I know why they're not in theirs, because Paul, the same guy, didn't write them. Why he didn't understand why Marcion didn't accept these. What was it? 3 texts, I think. Well, he didn't accept them because Paul didn't write them. These were not written by the Marcionites. They're later texts, So anyhow, I'm gonna throw that out there, try and clarify my position on the Pauline letters. They are all Marcionite. All the originals are. And you can see, once you start placing them as Marcionite and start comparing what's in Acts of the Apostles to what is in the Pauline letters, you can start cutting text out and saying this isn't real, because it's obvious that that's the later redaction. And once you take, there's only 1 or 2 mentions that are kind of problematic, and they just don't even look authentic. There's nothing authentic about them. So I wanted to throw that out there. And yeah, that's all I got for you today. Thanks, folks. Bye.